and welcome to Pullback, where we ask experts to explain big ideas so you get the full story behind the hype. Pullback is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network of progressive Canadian podcasts. I'm Kyla Hewson, and I'm here with my co-host, Kristen Pugh.
Hey, how's it going? It's been a while.
It hasn't been that long, I think.
No, it really hasn't, but...
Yeah. We finished our season in May, so hi, listener.
Yeah, excited to be back. We're still on a break. This is not a new season yet. We will be releasing a new season sometime in the fall. More interviews on climate justice, but this time, instead of focusing on policy solutions, what we really want to do is talk to people with lived experience of different forms of environmental injustice. And so I'm really excited for the one we're starting with, which is on youth climate justice. For that one, we interviewed Christina McRorie, who is the co-chair of the Government of Canada's Environment and Climate Change Youth Council, and also a board member on the Steep Hill Food Co-op in Saskatchewan.
Which is so cool. I love a food co-op. For those who maybe are here on the West Coast with me, I just started getting a CSA food box from Soul Foods. I don't know if they're a co-op or not, but they seem like a really cool business. It's like a community farm in the center of Vancouver. So shout out to them, just because that's what I was thinking about while I was listening to this episode.
Nice. That's a good takeaway to have. I feel like Christina would be very pleased about this. So
yeah, support your local farm people who are doing good work. Did you have any thoughts on this episode before we drop our listeners in on it? When did you record this, actually?
Gosh, a while ago. This was one of the interviews that I did as research for the book that I'm writing right now. So it's probably at least a year old. But I think it's a really good one. And a lot of the things that Christina said, they're not time limited, unfortunately. Haven't solved climate change in the interim. But I was very much impressed with Christina. I sort of knew that she was going to be a thoughtful and intelligent person, but she really blew me away. She's so well read and was so grounded, even beyond sort of the focus on youth in the episode, which, we do talk a lot about the experience of youth, but from a broader perspective of how to approach climate activism, I think it was a very helpful conversation.
Yeah, I really liked listening to her. She's great. I'm sure our listeners will like it. I think the only thing I would add, I was thinking while I was listening to this episode, is she made the very good point that I think she said specifically, it's not tenable to do a full-time job and do advocacy work in a lot of cases. And I've really been thinking lately about how to find work that lines up with your values. And I think that there's only so much you can talk about in an hour-long interview. But that's what I was thinking when she was like, oh, it's really hard for people who are working full-time to sustain themselves. And I'm like, yeah, that's why we need more onboarding opportunities for green jobs.
Heck yeah. I also liked how throughout she really resisted any urge where I had questions that might sort of suggest that older generations aren't doing enough. She was really always brought it back to a very positive frame, which I liked. But I thought it was also very helpful how she emphasized that there's always places that we can meet people, even, climate deniers. In a lot of cases, there are helpful intersections that we can work together on. And this idea that there needs to maybe be more emphasis in the movement on education and on trying to sort of bring people in. I think that's a really useful point.
Absolutely. And with that, listener, please enjoy this episode.
Just to get us started, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how young people in Canada are experiencing climate change in various different ways.
Definitely. I think I come at this from a myriad of perspectives, one being the Environment and Climate Change Youth Council, which is the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, 10 Canadians from across Canada, 10 youth who are meant to serve as a consultative body for federal policy. And then the other being, I live and work in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and the prairie perspective is its own thing, I think. And then a series of different organizations, university, academia, the work that I do, the nonprofits that I'm involved in. If I could be so bold as to represent all Canadian youth everywhere, which maybe I shouldn't try to do, I can really only speak for a limited perspective. But I think that one increasing trend that I see that is left out of mainstream climate discourse is that youth really connect climate change to broader systems, and generally systems of oppression. And I think that discourse is often written off as really radical or naive. One of the panels that I had at COP that I hosted was about youth discourses and youth eco-anxiety and disillusionment, but we connected it to a lot of survey data that talked about how youth are really disillusioned with the socioeconomic system. Youth are really, I think, much quicker than their older counterparts to talk about the role of neoliberal capitalism and colonialism in climate change. And I think that the existential dread that a lot of youth feel about climate change is an existential dread about many things, right? The cost of living crisis, the housing crisis. And so I think that for many youth, it's easy to become really cynical and, dare I say, sometimes apathetic, because it feels as though it's not just an environmental problem or a climate problem. It's a very broad systemic problem, or many systemic problems. So I think for a lot of youth, disillusionment and disempowerment are really common feelings.
Yeah, definitely. There's been some research that's come out recently that sort of it speaks to the very high levels of sort of negative mental health and emotional impacts of climate change that are particularly being experienced by young people in Canada as well as around the world. So do you think that's connected to that sense of disempowerment that you're talking about? And if so, sort of what are some of the ways that that manifests?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of the survey data that we used for this panel was the Kansas countries, and then survey data that was done on climate attitude of youth within Canada. And I remember some of the stats were really staggering, actually. One of the stats, I'll see if I can find you the particular survey it was from, but it said that, 91% of youth believe that capitalism as we know it will have to transform in order to solve climate change. Some of the other research that came from that was youth were asked to rank the most important actors that they perceived to be responsible for climate change and solving climate change. And they listed big banks, fossil fuel industry, government, and they placed the individual and sort of like community as much less important, which is interesting because it aligns with a lot of critical theory, critical research that really seems to point out that, without the broader socioeconomic context, you can't necessarily fault or, act as an individual actor. So I think that part of the anxiety and the disillusionment is the feeling of being an individual actor and knowing that that's not always the most powerful way to combat climate change, right? You might, turn the faucet off when you're brushing your teeth, but is that actually solving the problem? One thing that I've said quite a bit, and maybe this is a bit of an unfair comparison to make, but the disillusionment that pervades youth is, I think, the same disillusionment that pervades other groups, right? The idea that if you're like a blue collar, sort of like libertarian leaning person, your disillusionment might look like joining a freedom convoy. Or, we have over and over incredibly low turnout of Indigenous voters in federal elections because, why would you be part of a system that isn't going to serve you anyway? And so I think that disillusionment and disempowerment manifests in youth as purported like mental health problems. But I think we're seeing disillusionment with a lot of the systemic pieces in a number of different actors. And it's maybe just easiest to view youth as sympathetic because mental health is a lot more of a sympathetic cause than libertarianism.
For sure, yeah. And I think that sort of the point that feeling disempowered, it really sort of affects how we engage with the system, no matter sort of what groups we're from, is a really good one. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your role on the Environment and Climate Change Youth Council. Can you talk a little bit about what the Youth Council is about and sort of what you're doing as the co-chair there?
Yeah, I just took over as one of the co-chairs for this year. The term is 2 years, and we started in September of 2022. The body is meant to be consultative, and so we've advised on a number of the federal frameworks like the National Adaptation Strategy, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and then sort of for smaller departments, we've had some consultative sessions with Health Canada and the communications team in Environment and Climate Change on their federal climate change education strategy that was rolling out this year. So I think for a while, because it's the first youth council for environment and climate change since the 90s. So we're the first iteration, we're guinea pigs. And I think in many ways, the department's been really wonderful in letting us do what we seek to do and what we ask to do. But I think there's been some challenge sometimes in figuring out, are we consultative? Are we representative? Are we action-based, advocacy-based? And I'd say that for now, comfortably, we're consultative.
Maybe if I could get you to just speak a little bit about sort of what you've been hearing when you're having those consultations, or sort of what some key messages that maybe the council is sending to these federal government bodies? What are some of the key points that you would raise?
I will start by saying that the council this year is phenomenal. The diversity of background is really astounding. And we have people who are environmental engineers, people who studied environmental law. I come from sustainable development and climate policy and economics background. We have people who are on the mental health side of things, the financial climate finance side of things. So I think that there's a really broad array of perspectives. And because of that, generally we're unified in what we suggest. I also would maybe, again, hesitate to speak on behalf of the whole council, but I do think that some of the key things that we've been pushing for in government are broader systemic change to whatever degree that's possible. Maybe as a brief anecdote, I remember when I was sitting in the House of Commons last October, Pierre Poilievre and Justin Trudeau were arguing back and forth, and Trudeau was saying, grocery prices are going up, and that's why we're introducing this $500 grocery rebate. And Poilievre was saying, grocery prices are going up, and that's why we need to cut the carbon tax. And it was this conversation back and forth. And there was this one NDP MP in the corner, and he shouted out, "You're talking about the profit motive, Pierre. You're talking about capitalism." And I just thought it was interesting to see the two main parties in the House arguing about the same thing, but neither of them was talking about the root cause of the problem, which has been grocery oligopoly. And so I think that to whatever extent we've been able to, as a youth council, we've tried to push for changes to the root instead of just band-aid solutions. I think one thing as well that youth maybe have a good, the finger on the pulse of is the communications and messaging side of things. For me in particular, being from Saskatchewan, a lot of what that's looked like is maybe not viewing climate messaging as about a moral good, but rather about an economic good or advantageous in a myriad of ways, not treating the Canadian public as if they're unaware of certain things, that a strategy might not be as effective if it's pointing toward, again, individual action, suggesting that people limit their meat intake without looking at, well, are we still subsidizing agriculture? And I'm not saying that we should or we shouldn't, but how do we actually tell people not to consume meat if there's this other broad swath policy that is kind of contradictory to that? So I think the Youth Council has been wise and pragmatic in advising things that are the root causes of what's going on. Whether or not that's politically possible is maybe a different question.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that really goes to the themes that you were talking about earlier in the interview about how a lot of young people today especially do connect climate change to broader systems, whereas maybe sort of older generations have seen it more as like an environmental problem. Do you think that maybe comes from the fact that, we're really living the crisis now, or where do you think that sort of difference comes from?
I think there's a few things. I would preface this by saying that it's hard to know when I haven't lived through it myself. And for total clarity, I was born in 2000. So there's a lot that I haven't experienced, but some of my friends joke around that the 90s were the last good times. And I think what they're really alluding to is, sort of this idea that, you were sort of at the golden age of capitalism. The Cold War was over. Everyone in the developed world had their lawn and their picket fence, and things were economically stable. And the gap between the rich and the poor wasn't anywhere near as large as it is today. And then I think you really had this rise of multinational corporations and consumerism and mass production in a way that wasn't previously seen. Youth are already disillusioned with sort of this broader socioeconomic system. We don't have a lot of access to capital, and so we're less invested in defending the system because we haven't benefited from the system. And again, it's not just youth, right? I would argue that a lot of Indigenous communities and a lot of blue-collar workers have the same disillusionments with the socioeconomic system because they haven't benefited from it. But I think that part of the dissonance is that we use the same words and mean different things, right? I'm actually quite reticent to use the word capitalism because I know that when I say capitalism, that what my parents' generation is going to think of is industry and being a small business owner, as opposed to sort of all the qualifiers you could put in front of it of neoliberal, crony, unfettered. The socioeconomic system isn't working for us. And it's not working for the older generation either. For many people, maybe you own a house, but I think that my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation is really being rocked by the cost of living crisis, and there's a growing awareness around the way that, global exploitation plays into our production and consumption. So I think we have that awareness, but there's just a gap, I think, in how we frame it. And the idea that if you're against transnational corporations, you must be against all business altogether. Sometimes I joke around that I think the youth generation is quick to also say that if you're one person who rents out a room in your house, that you're part of the landlord class, as opposed to if you own, 20 different properties and price gouge, single mothers, that these are somehow the same thing, that you're a capitalist if you own a small business versus if you're Jeff Bezos owning Amazon. And so I think there's a gap in the discourse and how we talk to each other, because we're making similar arguments, but at the end of the day, not saying the same thing. Because I think if you talk to the farmers of Saskatchewan, they also hate corporations. They hate, seed patents that have taken away from them. They hate the same things that we do. And they know that climate change is happening, but they might not use those words. And so how do we meet people in the middle? And I think that youth are so often influenced by academic circles where there's like a purity politics in saying the right things, saying things that are, quote unquote, correct, as opposed to meeting people where they're at.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, for your perspectives on what sort of meeting somebody where they're at and meeting in the middle on climate change looks like, given is a very strong point that like we need to sort of be talking in ways that are persuasive to people. But on the other hand, you have this sort of like immovable crisis that we either solve properly or we don't, right? So how do we approach that, do you think?
I think it really depends on who you are. I never thought that I would be a government sympathizer, but I more and more sympathize with how difficult it is as the federal government, but any other level, I think as well, to get out a clear and concise message that accounts for nuance. As an individual person, maybe we have more responsibility in doing that. And I would argue, I really think about people as either good faith actors or bad faith actors, which is reductive. But to me, a bad faith actor is someone who has made up their mind they're not going to listen. Why would you bother arguing with someone who's intent on disagreeing with you? A good faith actor is someone who's genuinely willing to listen. You have to be a good faith actor and be willing to hear people out, because if you're talking to the farmers of Saskatchewan and their concern about something like the carbon tax is that it makes things more expensive and they can't put food on their table, that's a legitimate concern. And as a good faith actor, you have to hear that. But the other side of it is if someone is genuinely a good faith actor, I think that if you're part of an activist movement or part of a social movement, I actually do think you have a responsibility to play your part in that, which I think means hearing people out, presenting your opinions in ways that are common ground, rooting in the foundational values that I want everyone to be safe. I want everyone to have a livable home. I want everyone to feel a sense of community. I want our production and consumption models to echo those values. I think it's hard to disagree with that. And I think the reason this is maybe contentious is because it goes against a lot of what is also popular in activist or academic or youth-leaning spaces of, it's not my job to educate, which I fundamentally disagree with. I think there's a time and place, for sure. And of course, it's a lot of extra work. And especially as youth or activists, you do so much work that is unpaid, which is frankly untenable in many ways when you already don't have access to capital. But I think that there also has to be some softness and humility in realizing that we're never going to bring people along with us if we don't try to.
Yeah, and that distinction that you made between good and bad faith actors, I think, is also very key to that point. One of the sort of key messages coming out of the youth climate movement, which is now the largest environmental movement in history, is sort of this connection between climate change and justice. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what climate justice is from your perspective.
I think climate justice really comes down to the fact that the environmental system and the root causes of the environmental system cannot be viewed in a vacuum. Whether that is class consciousness and economic justice, or racial consciousness, racial justice, gender justice, I think it's the idea that these are overlapping systems. A lot of people sort of find their niche within the environmental justice movement, whether, again, that's gender or race or whatever it is. I think my personal hill that I die on is the sort of imperial relations of production and consumption, the world systems theory piece of it, in that we really do, as core imperial developed countries, take so much from developing countries, from global south. And I don't think that we'll ever be able to exist in an ethical or sustainable model if we're effectively pillaging and plundering less fortunate countries.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, to that point, you were recently at COP28, and the sort of loss and damage fund was a big conversation there. I'm wondering, like, to what extent do you see that as sort of like, it's obviously not the whole solution, but is it a good step? And what else is sort of needed to address that problem?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about how that's specifically implemented, how the funds are distributed, but I do think overall that it is an imperative step in the fight against climate change. I think one thing I see a lot in modern sustainable development discourse is that there's a lot of backlash to imperialist sustainable development that happened sort of from the 50s onward, the nation building style of sustainable development, the structural adjustment programs side of sustainable development. And so there's this attitude sometimes where there's a belief that the West has done enough. Now we're going to pull out. We'll never interfere again. I think it really absolves the West of a lot of responsibility to help repair the harms that it created. So again, I think the finer minutia of what does it mean to actually ethically support? How do we move into community-led development, community-led initiatives? I heard it once described as to, for, with, and by. So development used to be done to communities, and then it was for communities. Hopefully we're at a point now where it's being done with communities and can get to the self-sustaining point where it's done by communities. And again, development itself is a contentious word, but whatever word you want to use, that the initiatives are being done in partnership, and we're sharing tools and resources so that communities are able to help themselves. And then I think you avoid a lot of the sort of like paternalism, white savior critiques that are currently existing.
I want to ask about the future a little bit now. And you can approach it from like either or both sides of, for the future, sort of on the negative aspect, how does the future sort of look given climate change and the fact that we're really not on track to address it? But also, how could it look if we did take this problem seriously and addressed it from sort of like a justice-minded perspective?
I think how the future looks as a naive green youth where everything feels so catastrophic all the time and life feels so long in your 20s, you really don't have the scale for it. I think that's part of why youth are so disillusioned, is because we feel such an urgency and this idea that everything must be done now because we haven't had time to see how things sit and situate. Even the idea that where would we be if we hadn't had COP at all? What changes have been made now since the Paris agreements in 2015? I would say that change has been made, but 8 years seems like a long time, especially when the targets that we're thinking about are 2030, 2040, 1.5 by, whatever year or decade. It seems the window is increasingly small for sure. So I think in that sense, the future is really daunting, especially again for youth. The other perspective, which I think is sometimes the benefit of intergenerational relationships, as well as I think pretty commonly held in Indigenous communities, is the idea of long time, and that Earth has existed for so much longer than any of us can really conceptualize, and Earth will be okay, and we actually can't act with only urgency and haste, because that being the impetus of our work doesn't set us up for sustainability. And so how can we act in a way that is, in some ways, calm and calculated and pragmatic, with a love for the future instead of a reactivity to the future, I think is really important, especially for youth to keep in mind. The last thing I think about the future is I feel that there's a deficit in envisioning. The visioning exercises of what is the future that we want to live in. I think that there's a lot of Black American feminists that are particularly on this train. Octavia Butler, Adrienne Maree Brown. But I think so often because we're reacting to crisis, we don't spend enough time thinking about what's the alternative. And that's not to say that we'll have a perfect alternative completely figured out, but I do think there's something to be said about we've been so critical. We know what isn't working. What do the alternatives look like? What are we trying to build? It's one thing to know that certain systems that exist are oppressive or not conducive to well-being. What does it look like to have that? And what is the world that we want to live in? What could our model of production and consumption look like? How does that change our relationships to each other, on a local community level, but then also internationally? What does that solidarity look like? What are we working toward? Are we working toward not just avoiding, climate catastrophe, but hopefully, to me, healthier relationships with the land and stewardship of the environment and a really renewed sense of connection? So I think that that's part of where disillusionment stems from and part of what we're really lacking. It's hard to spend time doing that when it feels like we just need to solve crisis now. But I think we really set ourselves up for failure if we're not aiming towards some common collective goal of what humanity and this planet could look like.
Yeah, and it's clear that like that sort of vision, I suppose exercise, working towards that sort of broader vision is something that you've been thinking about a lot. It's very evident in your answer. So I'm curious if there are any sort of particular ideas that you'd want to share on that, knowing that's like a huge question. But
There's a few things that I bring up regularly that I think are a little bit less hippy dippy woo woo, because again, I think that certain ideas are really written off as a bit radical. Some of the more pragmatic ideas, which already exist, are things like cooperatives. A cooperative model of ownership, I think, really encourages community, encourages stewardship of business and industry, moves away from the infinite growth, profit at all costs model toward how do we reinvest in ourselves and reinvest in communities. I think part of that is local systems of production, which again doesn't mean that I'm completely against trade and specialization, but we probably don't need to be eating strawberries that aren't in season in the dead of winter in Saskatchewan. Maybe there's something to be said about how can we use the resources that are available to us and effectively thus, limit our carbon footprint, limit the amount of unnecessary transportation, and feel spiritually a renewed sense of connection to the place that we're in, to the community that we're in, to the food that we're eating, to the clothes that we wear. So I think a big piece of it is that sort of production consumption side of things. And there's a lot of ways to do that, right? Again, sort of the circular economy ideologies, a lot of the alternative economies that I think are being touted really get to a lot of those pieces really well. On the broader system of exploitation, colonialism is really thrown around as a buzzword without enough explanation of what we mean by that. And to me, it's one thing to think about colonialism in the North American context. I think that the first things that you think of are like residential schools, smallpox blankets. And I think that's hard for people to connect to the broader system of colonialism. And when we talk about unsustainable production models based on profit, that's completely antagonistic from an Indigenous stewardship perspective. It's antagonistic to using really, really deep embedded knowledge, ecological knowledge, for the good of the planet and the good of people. The way that our colonial ways of relating is that everything is transactional, right? I give you the money and you give me my good, as opposed to, again, like who made it and where is it from? The connection piece of things is really lost in colonialism. I think there's been some critiques that have been made about how the West is spiritually dead. And we're talking about a really tangible thing. When we think about the loneliness epidemic and the mental health crisis in the West, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're all overworking. We never get to see our friends. We never get to see our families. We don't have time for hobbies. We go and we generate profit as a productive member of society. And we've forgotten what it means to be human and what it means to connect with each other, with the land. So in short, I think it's really about connection with each other, connection with the goods that we have, connection with the land. Everyone, I think, needs to get outside a little bit more and outside in real nature as opposed to sort of manufactured nature. And then also, I think there's a fundamental paradigm shift that needs to happen where we view ourselves as an integrated part of nature, sort of the deep ecology perspective. So how do we live in a way that is integrated with the world around us instead of so separate from it? And then no wonder we feel depressed and anxious and distant.
It's one of these like ideas that I think has been around for a long time, but seems to be getting more traction lately, that like there really was this kind of ideological shift that came along with colonialism that was really rooted in separating us from nature and making it sort of this materialist, instrumentalist thing. I'm wondering, because, I mean, you do a lot. And one of the things that you do is you're on the board of the Steep Hill Food Co-op. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that and maybe sort of connect it to what you were just talking about in the last answer.
I love the Steep Hill Food Cooperative. I've been a member of the Steep Hill Food Cooperative since I was 16, I think, and just joined the board earlier this year when the position opened up. It was one of those things where I couldn't not do it for how much I love Steep Hill. So Steep Hill Food Cooperative is a grocery cooperative with sort of a socio-ecological mission around providing good food and making good food accessible, affordable. We exist in part of the city that doesn't have many grocery stores, so the idea of a food desert and then solving that problem while also trying to source locally, forge some of those relationships between production, farmers, especially being in Saskatchewan, and consumers. So again, economically, I really love and appreciate that Steeple Food Cooperative is not trying to make the largest amount of profit possible, that revenue is reinvested in the store, and that Steeple also really serves as a community hub. It's a place where you'll meet people from different generations, different walks of life. And I think we've lost community hubs. I've heard, and again, I didn't personally experience this, but I think for the older generation, the idea of sort of like Lions clubs, like men's clubs or things of this sort, it seems are less frequented now. And because of things like the cost of living crisis, I think it's harder for people to go out and do hobbies. And so spaces where you can meet or where you meet out of necessity, so places like childcare, groceries, things that you have to go to anyway, become all the more critical to the fabric of a community. And I think Steep Hill is just a really wonderful example of what an alternative to the dominant socioeconomic model could be. And of course, we struggle because we're operating within the current socioeconomic model. And so a transnational corporation or a grocery oligopoly can undercut prices so easily, or they can set prices, if their products are built on exploitation, right? The pricing piece is really, really difficult. And I don't blame anyone for not being able to afford more sustainable and ethical options in a cost of living crisis. So I think that's a challenge we have, but they really do exemplify, I think, another way of being.
Given how we started the interview talking about sort of this sense of disempowerment and despair, and it really seems like you approach things from a very sort of positive perspective. So I'm wondering if there is sort of a young person who's listening to this interview and feeling that sense of despair and disempowerment, what would you say to them?
I think what it comes down to is cynicism and apathy are understandable. They don't benefit anyone except the forces that are trying to keep you down. Me giving up that a better world is possible and relegating myself to a lifetime of apathy and hedonism serves corporate interests and doesn't make the world a better, more just, sustainable place for anyone. Again, while I have a lot of sympathy for it, and I've been there myself, I think most people do, it's infinitely more meaningful and also empowering to believe that change is possible. And why not go down trying? If nothing else, why not try? And that you thinking that change is possible and making an earnest effort to change the world and the systems that we're in invigorates other people to do the same.
Another sort of related question that I had, one of the stats that I found really upsetting from the study on youth mental health is that there's some fairly large number of Canadian young people who have tried to talk about climate change and they feel like they're ignored when they do. And so now they don't anymore. Have you experienced those kinds of attitudes and how do you deal with them?
I think there's a few moving pieces to this. One being, again, bad faith actors, and some people just will not listen to you. They're not going to give you the audience, and it's a waste of your time. And I think the discernment piece is that that's not where you should be. It's a waste of your energy. But I think the other piece of it is climate is really seen as an existential threat rather than a material threat for a lot of people, which I think the gap is closing as we experience, wildfires and natural disasters that make climate change more and more material and tangible for people. But I would also be curious as to whether the people who aren't willing to listen to ideas of climate change, what can we relate to them about? Are there issues around class consciousness, economic precarity that maybe feel more material to them? Again, this is, I think, the assumption that they're a good faith actor. But if we know that, as we said with climate justice, the environmental system is linked to so many other systems of oppression, what can we relate to them on? And that a Saskatchewan farmer who doesn't believe in quote unquote climate change is actually not my enemy. That is my ally in a fight against, a 1% or an elite that is really trying to, I don't even know if they're trying to keep people down. I think we've just built systems that perpetuate themselves and are really, really hard to change at this point. But at the end of the day, I think when possible, if someone won't give you the audience, you have the option to either discern whether they're worth your time or energy, or can you give them audience? And is there a shared or related struggle in which you can still build solidarity and allyship? Because I don't think everyone's going to fight the climate fight, and that's okay. I don't think we need everyone to. I don't think we need 100% of the population everywhere to agree that climate change is real and happening, right? I don't think that the critical mass actually has to be 100%. But can we get enough people along and aware of the root causes of why this is happening that we can still have that surge of momentum?
Maybe, you can't speak to that uncle about climate change, but you can get them on board with a wealth tax or something like that.
Totally. And I think, as you said, I think that's a really optimistic perspective, because I really don't want to discount that some people just will not give you the audience as a youth. And I think especially all of the micro identity pieces, for me as like a racialized woman, a young woman, all of these little pieces definitely make it harder. And I don't want to discount the pain or the arduousness of encountering those blocks. But I do also think that we have the responsibility, if we're trying to change the world, to say, okay, what next? What can we try?
One of the ideas that's been put forward is to sort of create a youth climate action corps in Canada. Is that something that you think would be helpful? And if so, what would you like to see?
I think that's imperative. I think that there's a deficit in the skills and training. And again, that the economic piece is such a big incentive for so many people, knowing that they're going to be provided for, knowing that they're going to have a tenable future. I think that there are, to my knowledge, federal programs that are being launched that echo that or are attempting to do that. Whether or not they're at the scale we need or have the funding that they should is less certain. But I do think we will need to see a really broad shift in our economy and in the labor that we do.
All right. So we've talked a lot about like the youth side, but sort of the other side of the coin, I suppose, is, there's a lot of older people who maybe aren't doing enough or who maybe aren't as active on this issue. And I think for a lot of sort of older adults, it may sort of stem from that same sense of disempowerment. And I think people feel a lot of despair, especially when they have children and grandchildren they see are going to sort of be growing up in this riskier world. What might you say to a good faith older person on this issue?
Yeah. Some of my strongest and favorite environmentalists and climate leaders have been septuagenarians, older generations. And I think for folks who aren't doing enough, whatever that sort of looks like, or however we're quantifying that, there's the question of why. I think the disempowerment piece is really big. The beauty of diversity, and not diversity as in sort of like the front-facing micro-identity diversity, but in like true diversity of experience and knowledge, is that we all do have different roles to play. Maybe if you're less able-bodied and you're in your 80s and you're not the person who's going to be out there pounding the pavement, you have such a wealth of knowledge that younger folks might not. When I was at COP28, I met Elizabeth May, and it was so insane to hear her talking about Paris Agreement, Kyoto Protocol, things that she had been at, things that she'd been at the negotiating table for, things that I've read about, right? But like I wasn't alive when some of that was happening, right? And so there's so much knowledge transfer that I think we're lacking. And for folks who want to do more but don't know how, if there's a support role or a knowledge transfer role, how can you empower younger people who, again, don't have capital? If you are economically secure enough, is there a way that you can support younger folks in doing that work if it's not going to be you that's out there? I think one thing that is really valuable to think about too is that the laboring class in terms of age is, sort of 18 to 65. And understandable that if you're working your full-time job, it's a little bit harder to go out there and do advocacy work. But it's no coincidence that when people retire, their extracurricular or community involvement skyrockets, right? That most boards for cooperatives boards for anything really is often senior citizens. Once you have that time, can you think about reinvesting in your community? And I think it's fundamentally fulfilling to do so. And I think a lot of people only find that once they retire and start volunteering. I'd maybe encourage people to see if there's a way that they can give back to their community prior to that. I think I'm having difficulty answering this because I know that there are so many constraints.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose maybe I'll frame the question differently then. What do young people who are trying to make change on climate change, what do they need from the older people in their lives?
I suppose what young people need from older folks is really dependent on what the older folks have. If you have capital, if you're economically secure, that's something that a lot of young advocates don't have, and it really limits their advocacy work. If you have institutional knowledge, political savvy, that's something that a lot of young folks struggle with. If you have a community network, people lack community and tangible support. The idea that when you lose a loved one, a community ideally rallies around you, brings food to you, picks up the slack for you. It is not feasible or tenable to work a full-time job and do advocacy work and then do all of the domestic reproductive work of cooking and cleaning and transport, and let alone once you start factoring in care work, care for your parents, care for children. And so I think that a lot of it is just community support. How can you show up for the people in your life? If you're not going to be the advocate or the activist yourself, which not everyone has to be, how can you support the people who are doing that work?
So I think I've been through all the questions I wanted to get through, but I always like to ask if there's anything that you wish I'd asked or that you'd like to tell me, just in case I've missed something.
The final takeaway that I often have in my climate work is that we have to believe a better world is possible. We're at a tipping point. It feels like we're on the edge of paradigm shift. And I'll talk to people about this, people of all generations, of all walks of life, and they feel the same. The preconditions for fascism and revolution look quite similar. So it's normal, I think, to feel a lot of fear and cynicism, because I think the times that we're in are really precarious. And I don't know, again, if I can say like unprecedentedly precarious, because like, what do I know? How long have I been here, But I don't know. I was talking to my 90-year-old grandmother and I said, you've lived through 2 world wars. Do you feel like things are worse right now? And she said, oh, for sure they're worse. so I think it's a normal response to feel that this is not okay. I think one of the things that we often separate from this type of work is the trauma side of things, the trauma and precarity side of things. I really think that the human condition can't be separated from the systemic, oppressive conditions that we're in. And so people who are doing pioneering work on somatics and trauma, and people like Gabor Mate and Johann Hari, all of these issues are so interconnected. We have a real responsibility to do work within ourselves so that we're as equipped as possible and as resilient as possible to do this work on a broader scale. But at the end of the day, everyone is just a human, and the conditions of precarity, the unsafe living conditions, the economic instability fuel so much of our current crisis and fuel so much of our polarization against each other. And so I think that a lens that I use a lot that I don't see as frequently in climate work is like a trauma-informed lens. And how do we bring the therapeutic dialogue of the importance of community and connection and security into our own lives and into the work that we're doing, which I think then helps a lot with sort of the infighting and the humanizing other people, taking people in good faith and being a good faith actor is like boiling things down to how at the end of the day, we're all just human. Joan Acker has this really powerful reading about how the micro is in the meso is in the macro. And what she means by that is that institutions are just a collection of people. And sometimes we think about these really big systems as bigger than ourselves. And sometimes I think they self-perpetuate, but at the end of the day, it is just all of us buying into an idea. It's hard not to uphold that idea when everything is set around that. Systems change is possible because human change is possible. I sometimes worry that I'm a little bit too pie in the sky, airy-fairy about things, but I think that the spirit side of things is actually one of the most grounded human things that we can talk about, and it's deficient in a lot of our work, I think.